So we'll start with a look at of China's overall economic growth. Now, these targets on this table are from China's two sessions earlier this year held in March. So there are lots of different targets on this table, of course, but the most important one, or the most eye-catching one, which I have highlighted in red, is the GDP growth target for this year. China set it at 5.5%. So last year's growth rate was 8.1%. That was, of course, coming from a very low base of 2020. And if you remember, Q4 last year, the growth rate was only 4%. And that was even before the huge lockdowns that we are seeing right now. For example, Shanghai has been in lockdown for nearly 2 months at the moment. And Shanghai alone, this city, accounts for nearly 4% of China's GDP. And, Shanghai's lockdown then won't bode well for China's economic growth this year. At least if everyone's locked down at home, the consumption side of the economy won't be able to contribute a lot to the economy either. In fact, the April number for consumption is a sharp decline of minus 11.1%. Now, I'll come to that a little bit later on. But if we just look at Q1's GDP number this year, it's actually not that bad. If you look at this chart, Q1 GDP number was 4.8%. That was better than expected. And why is that? Now, that's mainly due to China's relatively strong performance of January and February. Economic activities only started to slow in March. And in March, we saw Shenzhen started to go into lockdowns. So, to be honest, actually, there are some questions being asked around the world that how valid this Q1 number is. But also another reason is that this Q1 number, 4.8%, do not catch the full picture of Shanghai's lockdown, because Shanghai only went into a full lockdown at the very late of March and starting of April. So the full impact of Shanghai's lockdown will be reflected only in the numbers for Q2, which will come out in July. However, we expect it to be even worse than Q1. So to look into details, if we break the GDP components down to the main drivers, here are how they look like. No. On the left-hand side chart, you can see numbers from 2018 to 2022. And of course, the number for 2022 this year are our forecasts. So in Q1, there were two major events happened that are going to have very, very far-reaching impact throughout the whole year. They are, of course, first of all, the Ukraine war, and secondly, the lockdowns going on in China. Even now, we are only just beginning to see and to feel the initial impact of these two big events. And among the main drivers of the economy, we expect that only the investment will be somewhat, contributing positive to support China's economy. And because investment, that's the only area where the Chinese government can find some easy and quick fixes. Also, in early May, China's top leadership announced another push to build more infrastructure. And we expect most funds for those infrastructures will be coming from the state. So China essentially would be going back to the old playbook of launching big infrastructure projects to drive growth. Consumer spending, on the other hand, will certainly remain very weak, while government spending will be neutral. We'll come to that a little bit later in details too. Another driver is the exports, which actually did very well last year and contributed hugely to China's economic growth for 2021. But contrary to last year, exports this year will be somewhat negative. This is primarily due to China's lockdowns, during which, of course, many orders were urgently shifted outside China to some of the, say, Southeast Asian countries. Another reason is that the Western countries where most of China's exports go to have reopened, and people there are going to increase their spending on service items instead, like going to holidays and going to restaurants. Their demand, therefore, for Chinese goods will be lower. So these two factors adding together the exports for China this year will be slowing down. So where does that leave us for China's growth this year? We actually worked out a few scenarios that we want to share with you. So next, let's take a look of our scenario analysis. This is the scenario analysis. Obviously, this is very text heavy. We don't expect you to read every word of that. We are going to share the deck with you all after this webinar. We carefully examined a set of conditions on which China is likely to consider to reopen. And we came to the conclusion that the adoption and inoculation of mRNA vaccines should be seen as the game changer. So based on a number of assumptions centered around the mRNA vaccines, we worked out this scenario. Our base case is that China won't open up until second half next year, 2023. So the assumptions for that base case is China approves the domestic mRNA vaccine by end of Q3 this year and start to mass inoculate its population from November this year. Now the goal, we assume, is to inoculate all those elderly people aged 60 and above with 3 jabs. So now taking into consideration the production capacity and the pace of inoculation, that will take China till July next year to inoculate all the people aged 60 and above. Therefore, the reopen time will be second half next year. Now, more optimistically, our upside case is that China won't open up until February next year. The assumptions for that case is China approves both domestic and foreign mRNA vaccines by end of Q2 this year, which is just a month away from now. So mass inoculation then begins from August 2022, and all those aged 60 and above get a booster, so get 3 jabs by January next year. On that assumption, China is able to reopen from February next year. On the other side of the spectrum, our downside case is that there is going to be no approval of mRNA vaccines till end of this year. Then it's mostly what we are seeing now, no end in sight. So the country is plunged into a cycle of, say, lockdowns and open up and re-lockdowns and reopen up, and we see constant disruptions to both businesses and personal lives. So under these 3 different scenarios, we've worked out our GDP growth number forecast for China this year. And as you can see on this chart, for the upside case, 4.5%. Our base case is for 4.2% at this moment. While for the downside case, we've actually assigned a range to that. So the worst it can go 1.3%, and slightly better 3.4%. Now, apart from these 3 scenarios, we're also often getting questions from clients asking us, why can't China just abandon zero COVID, reopen and live with the virus from now on? Now, this actually leads to our alternative downside scenario, which we think is highly unlikely to happen.
Hi, my name is Krista Regani, and I'm Marketing Director here at FrontierView. I'd like to thank you for watching a segment of this webinar. If you'd like access to the full video and our latest insights, data, and research, sign up for a free trial with us today. Simply scan the QR code on the screen.